That would be helpful. And then I'm gonna put things on the screen so we can see them. So Sam, Chris, and I worked through a road mapping exercise over the last few weeks to try to nail down like specifically what are we doing? Like we knew dark mode was the thing. Dark mode is wrapping up, so what comes next? So this is all based off of the strategy note that Chris wrote late last year. The first, one of the big things that we talked about in that being unifying the various pieces of the design system into one singular source of truth. So that's going to be our first kind of major initiative that we're going to be looking at. Most of that is on the mechanical side of actually pulling all of the repositories together into a single place. So what Mark has been kind of leading on figuring out how we're going to approach that. Um, this is probably going to be mostly on the engineering side of like mechanically moving things around. There will be some work for design to think about the IA and about the content and about some restructuring that we need to do. But the specific work of that is probably going to get folded into some work that we have coming later this year to improve individual components. So here we've got a bunch of them listed out. That we're going to start with. We'll probably touch everything. So while I've got five listed here, you'll probably see this continue on for a couple of years as we go through the 20 or 30 components that we have outlined. And for each of these, we want to look at a whole host of details of that component. So the doing the health assessment that Jeremy had started describing last year, consolidating that documentation. So places where we've got it listed in a few spots, thinking about how we unify it and make it one singular message that people can follow and comprehend. Doing all the accessibility enhancements. There's a bunch of to-dos that are listed in the pajamas docs that we should go ahead and knock off. And then I expect from all of this, we'll find improvements that need to happen, and we'll go ahead and slot those into each of these epics as well. So the first five that we've picked out are, frankly, rather arbitrary. They're ones that I saw as like there's a lot of discussion around this, whether it be, we know that there's some accessibility and user UX issues with like tooltips, buttons. Everybody loves buttons. Drawers and drop downs are an area that have been getting a lot of attention. So it felt like these are a pretty good list to start down. But if you feel like, no, this is the one that we should start on, cool, great. Let me know. We'll shuffle things around. As we get further in, we'll have probably a better sense of how to rank these and prioritize these. But for the moment, it's very much a like, let's just pick something and get started. The other big thing that we'll have going is introducing more patterns. So we talked about this being one of the big needs that we have of not just focusing on the component level, but talking higher up. How do we help people at GitLab make better use of the individual components in a way that makes GitLab feel more consistent at a like larger holistic level? So Jeremy led the way on kind of prioritizing and sorting out the first few patterns that we need. Again, there will be more that we work on longer term, but some of the ones that we're going to start with are revisiting the progress and stepper pattern. This is supporting, I think, a feature that the growth team might be working on. So they've already got some of this in flight. So it felt like a good opportunity for us to partner with them. Be looking at lists, improving our filtering patterns, feature discovery, forms, tabular data, all the sort of things that are much bigger than individual components that we've heard folks saying like we don't have great answers for in the design system. The last piece that we'll be looking at, which is will be at the very tail end of the year, if not into FY27, we'll be moving into the core and extended libraries idea that we had. We'll probably touch on this some with the component maturity stuff and unifying the repos, but we'll look at it as a dedicated effort once we have a single source of truth, which we expect to wrap up in Q3 or Q4 of this year. So once we've got that in place, then we'll actually start figuring out, how we document and all of the process and governance stuff that we've got to do to manage those libraries. So that was the plan that Chris, Sam, and I put together. but it's open to feedback as well, right? All of this stuff can be shuffled around pretty easily if there's something that y'all think is more important or less important. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what you think about this and what we should be doing instead.
This is awesome, Jeff. Thank you for the organization here. I'll have to maybe either right after this or offline with you or whatever. But I've got some movement going on some drop down stuff and combo boxes and some other things that
Okay,
we'll sync up on.
that's fantastic. Yeah, I know we had a bunch of accessibility issues around those that I'd seen you
Mhm.
helping out with. So,
I'm gonna I'm gonna direct this question directly at Mark on this one. That unified source of truth, the design system, like relies quite heavily on the stuff that you've been looking at recently. Does this feel like a good time frame to execute on what you've been looking at? I've pulled it not fully out of the air, but mostly out of the air. So I'm definitely looking for your feedback here.
Which time frame specifically are you talking about?
the
To
this
unify the
year.
source of truth, the design system. So basically pulling in all of the things that you want to do for pulling things off Storybook and pulling it all onto design.gitlab. However that looks, like, does this feel like a decent time frame for that work, right?
In short, yes. I would hope to be. I'd hope that this is actually a bit pessimistic. This time frame that you've set.
Yeah.
Some unknown unknowns from me, or known unknowns, is how information architecture affects how we go about this. Like, off the top of my head, things that I just have no idea what we're going to do with is we've got, say, GitLab UI exposes a bunch of like utilities and little components that aren't design system things. They are just things that live in GitLab UI. Um, how do we document those in design.gitlab.com? Where do they live? And then there's another question where we expose components in GitLab UI that are called, for instance, GL segmented button or segmented component or whatever it's called, which under the hood is a button group. And that's kind of what the design system wants it to be, but we've exposed it in this sort of nicer API. So how do we document that? And then we've got the sort of design system view of what a component is, which isn't quite in alignment with what the front end engineer calls a component. There's sort of overlap, but there's also some dissonance. So getting that documentation right, I have no idea. But I think that's certainly something that we can just deal with at the time. We don't need to forward plan for that. And
Yeah.
the sort of information architecture, we don't need to get it right first try.
No, I think this is something that Jeff, Chris, and I talked about as well, right? Like, there's a lot of engineering lifting here, but there's also like a team effort to figure out what that IA, not AI. It's really easy to get them the wrong way around and talk about something completely wrong. The information architecture, right? Like, I think we worked that into the plan. Is that right, Jeff? Like,
Yeah, it
some
looks
time
like
for
we've got
design to
about a
come in as well.
milestone's worth of work for a designer in Q2, and then a couple milestones worth in Q3.
Mhm.
And that's specifically focused on the information architecture piece, like helping to answer those questions so that engineering can actually implement it. Now, that's not, again, going down into the weeds on specific, like, oh, what do we call button group versus segmented control, whatever, right? Like, we can get into that in these specific epics that we've got for those topics. So, this is really like big picture IA. And, how do we think about, you know, patterns versus what should be in branding versus pajamas and all of those sort of shaping of the documentation sort of questions. So there's probably an intermediate state where we have things consolidated, but it's still rather messy. And that's okay because we're going to work through each individual thing to tighten up the documentation.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
agree. There will be a long-ish phase of weird in betweenness. Yeah, I agree.
exactly. That's still better than where we are right now, where we don't even know what the weird inconsistencies are because they're all over the place. At least if they're in one page, we can easily see what's inconsistent and we can talk to those directly.
I'd even go as far as to argue we're in a phase of weird in betweenness at the minute, and that's what we're trying to solve, right? Like, um, but yeah, yeah. Okay, good, good, good. Yeah, and all my estimates are pessimistic because pessimistic estimate, they're the best ones, right?
Especially for
And
road mapping.
I would have been the first one to tell you if it was too optimistic. So
Which is why I called you out specifically, just in case
good.
you
Yeah.
weren't sure what we were saying here, right? Like, appreciate that, Mark.
Yeah, and just so that it's on the record, like these are not commitments. We have a process for committing to the roadmap, this whole interlock thing that you probably heard about. Most of this will not be on there, right? Things that are granular, sort of business as usual sort of work, that doesn't really rise to the level of like committing to the business that folks are asking for. The things that we probably will see on there are things like this unified source of truth, where I'm talking with Sam about that in a separate thread about like what percentage of confidence do we actually want to put to delivering it in Q4. Things like the core and extended libraries, like those big initiatives where if if we're falling behind, the business will help us by pulling resources from elsewhere, right? Like it'll give the entire business the ability to see all of the priorities that we have. And if we're falling short on something the business thinks is important, then we can get the resources that we need. So um, you'll see some of this get committed at the company level, but most of it will not be. And so the dates are, who knows? Guesses in the wind.
But this is still useful because it's
Mhm.
like we can see where we are, where we said we should be versus where we actually are as we go through it, right? Like, um,
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
I really like this.
For sure. Um, and just to call it out, um, everything in this plan is written out to assume that we have design and engineering working together on things. So as much as possible, we kept the design and the engineering headcount like bundled together. So there are some places where design has to lead, some places where engineering has to lead, but as much as possible, we wanted folks working together, kind of like we did in the last few months of the dark mode rollout. Like that worked really well. We want to continue that model as much as possible for all of this stuff. And so that's to some extent why some of these timelines are so drawn out is because we have six front end devs and we have two designers. And so just the ratio we want everybody to pair up with design on this stuff, there's design is kind of the long tail for all of this. So as a result, there is a fair bit of excess engineering capacity in most of these quarters. So we'll probably have a lot of space for pulling in, component fixes and defects and accessibility issues and all of the things in our backlog that have been sitting there for a while. We'll have space to start pulling those in. All right. If you have any other thoughts, any other feedback, feel free to reach out to me async. Hit up Sam and Chris as well. This is not, mandate from on high. This is just trying to set some direction. And as always, we want y'all's input on what it is that we should be doing.
Dan had a couple of points there. I want to make sure he
Oh,
gets a chance to say them.
yeah,
Oh,
please.
thanks. Thanks, Sam. Um, Thanks for pulling this together, Jeff. As part of the unified source of truth, um, are we expecting it to include any updates into how, are we expecting it to include any work around how updates to the design system happen going forward to help things stay in sync? I think the reason I ask is one of the main drivers for the single repo approach was to help solve the problem of stuff going out of sync. And I'm not fully confident that technology alone can solve that.
Um, can you give me a little example of something that has gone out of sync? Does anything come to mind?
Uh, well, let's say drop downs. Um, the drop down tip For example, the little thing that pointed to the drop down thing that triggered it. The doc said that there was a tip and it should point to it. The Figma component designers were using had a tip that could point to it, but the coded component didn't. And so we had docs saying one thing, the visuals, the stuff that designers were using for their mocks and artifacts, not, and the code being something different. Um, as one example, a trivial example.
So, um, so there are three parts there. There's the implementation, there's the design documentation, and there's the Figma spec. Um, the unification of the repos, I think, partly addresses the implementation and the design documentation agreeing because they'll be literally in the same repository and you can update them literally in the same merge request in theory.
Yeah.
If we go ahead with what I'm planning, that obviously will require um, acknowledgement and buy-in from maintainers to enforce that. Because you can't automate that. You can't sort of say, oh, well, you've changed this and you need to document that. You can't really. Maybe AI could help with that. A1. Anyway, the Figma stuff, though, is different. Figma is much harder to keep in sync. The best idea I've had so far, because we talked about this a bit a month or two ago now, Dan, is to just have Figma embeds in the design.gitlab.com so that you can see in the documentation the Figma spec with the implementation, at least relatively close. Beyond that, that's the hard part. That's the bit that I don't really know how to improve that much beyond just processes. And also, to some extent, it could be argued that Figma specs are aspirational, or maybe I'm wrong about that.
Maybe. I my personal opinion is the assets that we provide as the Figma component library are assets, not a spec, and that a spec for a component could probably come from somewhere else and be done in a one second, my lovely. I'll write that thought down.
I think that specifically in the aspect of Figma getting out of sync with the other assets and repos, we will need to look at our process to figure out how to sort of do our best to keep things from getting out of sync again. Especially if we're doing all this work to bring everything into sync, we'll want to make sure that work doesn't just deteriorate over the months and years when we get past a component. So yeah, I would expect us to spend some time looking at this process to kind of figure out what the best way forward is. But right now, we just don't have we don't have a solution for that.
Could the health status help with that? Like, I know we've not fleshed out what that is and what that looks like yet, but could one of the points on it be is in sync with Figma, red light, green light, whatever that is, right? Like, um, although arguably, if you know that it's out of sync, don't change the light, change the Figma file. Like, uh, yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking out loud.
Yeah, I think there's
Yeah.
potential for that. I know documentation is one of the aspects of component health. I think that does get a little weird then. Like, does then the moment you update something, does the moment you update the implementation of a component, boom, suddenly Figma is out of sync and now someone needs to adjust that? I think those are the process things that we'll probably need to look at in more detail once we get a bit farther into this.
Yeah.
It's maybe one of these like um, merge quest checklist things. If you're updating the implementation, has a designer signed off on this and sort of scheduled work to update the Figma file to reflect those changes, and vice versa for Figma changes, I guess.
I think
Something
that's
like
what
that.
our component lifecycle was intended to do, but it doesn't quite work.
Yeah, checklists are great at having people go, yeah, no, I definitely followed the checklist. as we saw when we looked at the ones for dark mode, right? Like it's tricky. The MR checklist at the minute for it'd be shorter for GitLab UI, but the one for the main GitLab repo is very long, and I am certain nobody does everything on that for every MR.
I bet we could probably get smarter with CI/CD too, and have like automatic branching in Figma or vice versa. We can create some hooks and triggers in there that make things more interesting and automated at certain points. But
Something to
Yeah,
think
it's
about.
definitely something we can continue exploring further. We're getting a little in the weeds on that specific conversation, so let's just make sure that we look at it when we've got design working with engineering on this unified source of truth epic, um, so that we can sort out the details there. All right. We got about 5 minutes left here, and I wanted to hit on the active projects that we've got going on. Um, in particular, so we're in this kind of GA period for dark mode, where it's mostly a waiting game to make sure that nothing breaks horribly, and then we'll call it GA. But there are two specific features that we've heard pretty loudly that folks want as part of this. One is to map the syntax highlighting theme to the application theme. So if you turn on dark mode, you shouldn't have a light syntax highlighting theme, right? Like that's switched over by default. Um, and the other is to automatically enable the dark mode when requested by the user agent, right? So that's the system. You've got your Mac configured to say, I want dark mode. That tells the browser you want dark mode. Dark mode tells GitLab.com it wants dark mode. But right now we ignore that. So I think if we implement those two things, we'll be fully ready for GA on our side. Um, and I know we've got an issue for one of them and some conversations for the others. So.
Sorry, Jeff, do you mean like the auto dark mode?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's already a thing.
That
We already have
works.
that.
That works.
Maybe we just need to default it or set that as the default option
Oh,
then,
okay.
because right now default is still light. And there was feedback in the feedback issue, like specifically for unauthenticated users coming into GitLab, they wanted it to respect their dark mode preferences, and it didn't currently.
Yeah, that should literally just be a change in the defaults. That
Even
should be a
better.
really easy change. Yeah, this Scott did this ages ago, I think. Like,
Okay.
um, yeah, yeah, should be a nice easy change that one.
Update to update to make the default auto. Cool. I'll make sure we've got an issue for that in the backlog then.
Do we need to do this after GA or in the run up to GA?
I'd like to have them in the run up to GA so that we
Yeah,
have kind of essentially so we can wash our hands of it once it
yeah,
goes public
that's fine.
and totally focus on something else. Um, but I mean, neither of these I would block GA for, right? So
Mhm.
they're just very high priority things that we've heard many, many, many times over in the lead up to it. And we've always said we'll do it for GA. So it seems like now's the time to do it. Jeremy, to your question, why, you use what you like and you wouldn't expect it to change. I think that's fine. I'm not saying that we remove those options. I'm saying that
Okay.
most people so far have provided feedback that they want them to be synchronized, and so that we should satisfy that user need.
do you know like it gets a I think it gets a bit hairy because we have multiple light, multiple dark options, and none of them would be fully accessible today. So
Hmm.
there's other considerations there, like just what we even use, or can we introduce like default accessible syntax highlighting themes as well? Because I think we're opening up another can of worms by choosing certain things by default that may not be accessible for a user.
Yeah, I mean, that's a separate concern in my mind because we've already got the syntax highlighting themes. They have the issues they have today. Folks are basically saying, like, I use the Solarize theme on when my application is in light mode, I want it to use Solarize light. When my app is in dark mode, I want it to use Solarize dark. That feels like something that we can do. So just essentially like have a new option for solarized auto, right? It's up to design to figure out how we best approach that, but I'm not thinking that we revisit all of the themes, just try to make it so that we have some more automatically switching themes.
Okay. And will that sync with Web IDE too, or
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, we'll have
okay.
to partner with the team that owns the Web IDE to figure out how to manage that. All right. Any other updates on the dark mode GA? Has there been anything that folks have heard about feedback or concerns or defects coming up from it? We've got the feedback issue, but it's been pretty quiet.
I know that, and in fact, our AMAs have been pretty much empty on the
Yeah.
America time slot. Um, I suspect people are just ignoring it, and they really
Yes.
don't have any sense that they're responsible for it. They're just ignoring it until something comes up and they get flagged for it. So
Yeah.
um, that's my impression.
I suspect you're correct. I've tried to get folks on like the product leadership side to push down the message, and I think it's gone out a couple of times, but folks all have their roadmaps full of urgent priorities, and so getting in that list is always going to be tough.
And we're not alone in that. We see that play out with
No,
AI
not at
and,
all.
and other things too. So it's probably this is probably the least of the concerns, but we need like an I told you so like landing page or something.
That'll make us popular. Um,
Yeah.
no, but I mean,
And,
again,
and
thankfully, so much of everything looks great already, right? Like, I'm not really worried about going to GA right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are style fixes. So it's,
Hmm.
yeah, I agree.
so Dan and I were in one last week, and the two questions were, "What is dark mode?" and "What do I need to do again?" So yeah, the quality of the questions in these AMAs is, I mean, yeah, ask anything, obviously, but like I'm really struggling with this component. How do I fix this in dark mode? And I'm not seeing them questions, right? Like I imagine the more we put this on people to fix, we'll see more of them questions come up and we can just direct them to the AMAs. But yeah, I'm also seeing pretty low attendance.
Okay.
For things like, so you pointed something out earlier, Jeremy, the manual issue sorting, like that shows up in hot pink because we don't have the right design tokens for it. At this point, should we be saying, hey, plan team, whichever plan team it is, like here's something you'll need to fix for dark mode. If you need help, come join the AMAs. Like, is that something we want to be doing at this point, or are we waiting? What are we doing with those kinds of things, right?
I know personally, I'm just like, if I like that one, I created an MR because I thought, oh, maybe I can fix this. And I realized, oh, this is drag and drop. There's no drag and drop affordance. It looks like no other drag and drop on the site. Uh, it's not behaving in the same way. So that one was a rabbit trail, but Dan is looping in that team to help be like, hey, what do you think this should look like? And then we can do some of that coaching with them. So, thank you, Dan, for doing that. That's kind of my approach is to just, if I see it and I think I can fix it, great, get a start, jump in. If not, at least there's an artifact for somebody else to pick up and you know it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I
awesome.
think it, yeah, I think there's another one that I opened up just in the design system. Like there's still a lot of the neutrals declared, like as the defaults and styles for things. And so I think we've got a number of things that we could do for GA within the design system to alleviate those and remove those. So um, I see like a lot of like, GL gray 10 or, things like that, that I'm like, and I can't find a way to even render it in GitLab UI. So I can't do any kind of visual regression testing or like, is this accurate? So some pairing on that would help. But I do know that there's a number of instances in the Like I see hot pink when I go through the design system too, or through GitLab UI, that we could fix as part of GA.
Yeah, that'd definitely be a worthwhile effort. I think we probably have some engineering capacity over the next quarter, so we'll put that on the short list.
With them ones where you're not sure where it is, because we have visual regression testing, you might be able to just make it hot pink, run the pipeline, and then see where the visual regression failures are, and it should point you to the
It
components that it changes, right?
it's things that I can't even get to render anywhere, so I don't even know if there are screenshots for it. Like it's like if it's under this condition, this class gets applied, and I have no way to apply that
Right. See.
condition. Like there's binary, like true false on is this view only or read only, and then other things. But then in Storybook, like there's no controls. It just says, "Hey, here's a way to set up controls for this," And so I'm like, I have no way to even do it in the UI. So, and I'm not savvy enough with Vue to go in and add these things to like test it and get it to render. So those kind of things.
Sorry, Jeremy, is that in GitLab UI?
Yeah,
I
there's
can
one
take a look
like
at that with you if you want.
yeah. I'll just Jeff, let me know if I'm rabbit trail. I don't want to take.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Uh, just real quick, like, let's see here. It would be, yeah. So this example here, it's the. Let's go over here. It should highlight for me in filtered search, view only. Turn this on. Refresh. So I pick up on this background here. So I've got an MR to fix that. However, when I started looking into any of these, the filtered search, I came across like all of these other instances where there's like multiple instances of like gray 10 or other neutrals, but I cannot figure out how to render those. And so, like one example, let's see if it should pull up here. Um, just a border GL gray 200, and it's in this template, but I don't see this like template populated anywhere. And so some of them might be, and I just don't know how to access it, but it's a lot of things like that. But I can link up that.
Do you mind
Uh,
tagging me in that? And I'll take a
yeah.
look at it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, James. All right. We're a bit past time. Mark, did you have anything urgent or important to share about your work on unifying the design system, things that you're waiting on folks for?
No. The people I need to speak to are not on this call. So,
Got it.
but just a little heads up. I think I know what our immediate next steps are, and they unfortunately are a bit sort of not parallelizable. But hopefully after that we can start to parallelize work in terms of like moving content over and so on. So I'm going to push what's the word? Submit. Write a note somewhere outlining what I think we should be doing, and then we can start actually doing it.
Fantastic. Looking forward to seeing that. All right. Anything else y'all wanted to hit on today? Any other questions, topics? Cool. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you have a lovely Tuesday. I'll catch you later.